Hello, world history. Welcome to U0-L7, How We Measure Historical Events. This is Miss Corey. As with most lecture videos like this one, I talk fairly fast, so make sure you are paying attention. Learning targets understand how time is measured, distinguish between AD, BC, and CE, BCE, understand basic concepts of a timeline, and how to do three main questions to analyze historical documents. So your job today is you're going to answer any questions in blue text directly on the Edpuzzle. So these questions will pop up on the side of the Edpuzzle video. Answer them the best you can. I'm not necessarily grading on what you get right or wrong, especially for these blue text questions, because usually the blue text questions are like prior knowledge questions, like things you know, or maybe a prediction or something like that. I will give you credit just as long as you give an educational guess. Now, if you give me a answer that's like super off topic, or you don't answer at all, that's where I deduct points from the Edpuzzle. Just remember, I do individually grade all of your Edpuzzle answers. And again, if you're not getting the questions that pop up to the side, make sure that you turn off your ad blocker for Edpuzzle. All right, you might also be like, teacher, I got a 0 or a 1.7 or a 3 or like a 4.44 on my Edpuzzle, but I watched it all the way through. I answered all the questions. What's up with that? Again, don't panic. This is just Edpuzzle kicking a grade into Schoology. It's just telling you that you completed the assignment. Now I, as the teacher, need to go in and grade it. So again, give me a couple days to do that. Typically, Edpuzzles are worth about 5 points. Sometimes they vary. But again, if you get like a weird number at first, that's why. Don't panic. And again, watch the Edpuzzle all the way to the very end, or else you won't get points. If you don't get points, I don't see you did the Edpuzzle. And if I don't see you did the Edpuzzle, you get marked absent. So don't do that. That would be sad. So do you have any questions about Edpuzzle? And if you don't have any, you can just write none. All right, let's get started with the slideshow. So what is time? So here's my first question for you. Who defines time? And how do you describe time? Now, again, this is just an educated guess. Don't Google it or anything like that. This is just the answer that I want from your brain. All right, now here's another really good question. What is history? It's a big question, but history is the chronological record of significant events as affecting a nation or an institution, usually of their causes. So, what is time? Time is the measured or measurable period during which an action, process, or condition exists or continues. And how we measure time. So, in the modern time, we measure with seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries, millenniums. But here's a really good question. With our calendar, is our calendar that we use on a daily basis, so the one, January, February, March, April, May, the only calendar that exists in this world? No, there are many, many ways that people have recorded time throughout history, and there's still other calendars out there even today. Like right now, the year is actually 5,785. That's according to the Hebrew calendar. It begins with what the Hebrews believe is creation about 3,760 BCE. The year is also 1446. That's according to the Islamic calendar. This calendar began with the year that Muhammad fled from Mecca, and we'll learn all about that in Unit 7. All right. So, about 10, probably even more years ago, schools used AD and BC. Do you know what AD means? And do you know what BC means? If you don't, that's okay too. All right. So the calendar most commonly used in the Western world, so the one, January, February, March, has origins from the birth of Christ. It's called the Gregorian calendar. So AD mean Anno Domini, which means the year of the Lord. So the year that Jesus was supposedly born. And then BC is before Christ. In 1582, Christopher Clavius introduced our present calendar, which allowed 365 days in a leap year every year that is divisible by 4. So that's when we get the extra day in February. All right, and here's a nice painting of Pope Gregory devising a new calendar. All right, but BC and AD are kind of old terms. We don't technically use them anymore as historians. Today, historians use CE and BCE. BCE is like the old BC, and BCE just stands for before Common Era. None of the dates change or anything like that. It's literally just the symbols at the end of the dates. Same thing with CE. So CE is like the new AD. CE stands for Common Era. And again, the dates don't change. So as you can see here, like year 1 would still be the year 1 if it was like AD or CE. So for example, July 4th, 1776 CE equals July 4th, 1776 AD. See, is the exact same dates, just the end symbols change. Same thing. September 12th, 2023 CE would be September 12th, 2023 AD. Same thing with July. July 13th, 100 BCE would equal July 13th, 100 BC. So some websites are still updated with the BCE and CE, but some are still kind of old and use the BC and AD. So the reason why I'm explaining this to you is because when we do research projects and stuff like that, you might come across a website that uses BC and AD and another one that uses BCE and CE, and I just don't want to make you like confused. They literally mean the same thing. So, timelines. What is a timeline? A timeline is a chart that shows events in a flow of time, giving you a picture of how they relate to each other. Events are linked to the timeline by lines to the point precisely where they occurred, and they are divided into even divisions depending on the length of time shown. So, typically, down below, you would have the years. You would have the timeline segmented in some way. For example, this is every 10 years. And then above, you would have the events that occurred within those years. And it doesn't have to be years either. So this is a really interesting timeline that we have here. So this is actually broken up by days. And you can see this was an example of Hurricane Katrina and back in 2005. And then you can see the events that occurred are usually above the line itself or below the line itself. All right, so here's a really big question. When do you think history begins? It's a tricky question because, people would be like, "Oh, it doesn't. There is no beginning to history." Actually, there is. And history begins with writing. That's right, the invention of writing. So before the invention of writing, those are pretty much more archaeologists and anthropologists who study humans before writing. But with historians, we begin with writing. So writing was invented about 3,400 to 3,100 BCE. And there are 4 distinct places where writing emerged separately across the globe. The first one would be Mesopotamia, which is going to be right over here in the Middle East. Then we have Egypt, which was about 300 or 3,250 BCE. Egypt's right up here in North Africa. China also invented writing in about 1200 BCE. And then in southern Mexico / Guatemala in about 500 BCE. So all 4 of these places developed writing without influence of each other, which is really interesting. So prehistory. Prehistory is the time before writing. So everything before about 3,400 BCE would be prehistory things. And prehistory is not too far away, by the way. For example, if you go down to Comfrey, Minnesota, which is in the southern part of Minnesota, you can find the Jeffers pyroglyphs, and they're about 7,000 years old. So that's prehistory, but humans were still walking in, well, our state. Artifacts. Artifacts are human-made objects such as tools or jewelry. We'll talk about artifacts a lot, especially when we talk about more ancient histories. Who studies these artifacts? So, archaeologists study bones and artifacts of humans and pre-humans. We'll talk a little bit about archaeologists as well as we get into like the Middle East areas. Then you have anthropologists. So, anthropologists actually study culture or a group's way of life. The cool thing about anthropologists is that they can study groups that are dead. So, like groups that were like thousands of years ago, or they can study groups that are still alive today. And then you have paleontologists. So paleontologists are a little bit different. They study fossils, but mostly plant and animal remains preserved in rocks, not necessarily human remains. So that's where like dinosaurs and stuff come in. All right, so let's talk about the very, very early humans. So, one of the oldest pre human remains found is named Artie. Artie is about a 4.4 million-year-old female. She was found in Ethiopia, which Ethiopia is right over here. And it was found about 46 miles from another very famous skeleton named Lucy, who was about 3.2 million years old. And then the really cool thing about Artie is one of the first biped, meaning that she walked in two limbs. But she was also a quadruped, which means that she would climb trees with four limbs, so her hands and her feet. She is not considered a human yet, just very human-like. So when did we take our first steps? So this was a discovery back in 1978. Mary Leakey and team discovers prehistoric footprints in Tanzania. They are called the Laetoli footprints, and they belong to humanids, or creatures that walked upright. And these footprints, which you can see right here, are about 3.6 million years old. Wouldn't that be crazy if you're just wandering around like the desert and all of a sudden you see these footprints and they're millions of years old? That's insane. So then we also have evolution. I'm sure you guys all talked about this in biology. So eventually these humanoids would evolve more and more into modern day human, and they would take their first steps outside of Africa. And you'll learn more about this in Unit 1. All right, so let's switch subjects just a little teeny tiny bit. So, documents. We'll do a lot of analyzing primary source documents in this course. So, here's a question for you, and some of you may or may not know this answer, but just give your best educated guess. What is the difference between a primary source and a secondary source? All right, so a primary source is documented by someone who witnessed or experienced the event. A secondary source would be documented by someone who is interpreting the event. So they did not witness or live through the event themselves. So, for example, here's my World War II example. This soldier right here, he is at Pearl Harbor. He is witnessing the event. If he went and he like wrote a book or told his family about what happened, he would be a primary source because he was there. He was there living Pearl Harbor. Now, a secondary source would be this radio right here. So the news reporter who probably wasn't there during the events, and that news reporter talking to the American people about what happened, that would be a secondary source. Because again, the news reporter probably wasn't there at Pearl Harbor. All right, so primary and secondary sources, they could be written, they could be on TV, they can be spoken, videotaped, they could be artist represented, diaries, letters, memoirs, journals, speeches, manuscripts, interviews. They could all be primary and secondary sources. It doesn't just have to be written sources. So, again, primary source example would be the Declaration of Independence because it was written by the founding fathers themselves. A secondary source would be this book right here, Martin Luther King Jr., A Biography by Roger Burns. The reason why that's a secondary source, it wasn't written by Martin Luther King himself. It was written by a different source about him. All right, another good example. Primary source. I went to the Mall of America today and saw Harry Styles on the Ferris wheel, right? You are witnessing Harry Styles on the Ferris wheel. You are there for the event. That is a primary source. Secondary source would be my friend went to the Mall of America today and saw Harry Styles on the Ferris wheel. That's a secondary source because You yourself were not there to witness it. Your friend witnessed it, and now she's telling you about it. All right, let's do a quick little quiz here. So primary versus secondary quiz. So which of these four sources are primary sources? It's a little tricky. So the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, that is a big thumbs up. It's the autobiography, meaning that Ben Franklin wrote it about himself. So that is for sure a primary source. All right, the New York Post, talking about Queen Elizabeth's death. Yeah, that's going to be a secondary source because Queen Elizabeth didn't write it herself. It was some reporter or journalist or something that wrote it about her. Now, documentaries can be kind of tricky. So, documentaries themselves as a whole are considered a secondary source. But with that said, a lot of time with documentaries, they'll have primary sources embedded with them. So, for example, like during the Civil War, if this documentary had like letters that soldiers would write home to their families, then those sections of the documentary would actually be considered primary sources because it's coming from text from people who witnessed the event. But as a whole, documentaries are considered secondary sources. A primary source would be, yeah, interviewing Taylor Swift about her Eras tour. That is so a primary source because it's literally asking Taylor Swift about her own tour. All right, now let's talk about some grammatical symbols in historical texts. So, if we ever read a historical text that has these brackets with SIC in them, that means the translator of the text is letting the reader know that there is a grammar mistake in the original language and the translator is leaving it as an error. So, for example, if I said, the two of us are going out to dinner tonight at Maynard's. So, that's the wrong kind of two, but the translator wanted to leave the grammatical error. So that's why they put the SIC in brackets, just to let the reader know, hey, I know this is the wrong two, but I'm going to leave it because that's how I translated it. You may also see footnotes. So footnotes is when the author/translator wants to make a note about the subject being written. The note is usually then included at the bottom of the page. So for example, if we said, he is the powerful god of all of Greece and all other gods are below him, I would then look at this one symbol and I would go to the bottom of the page and I would see the other one symbol. And it says Zeus. So that's what he is referring to. Zeus, the Greek god of the sky, the ruler of gods and humans. You might also see ... or brackets with ... That means that the original text is broken or missing, but historians don't know what words are missing. This happens all the time with ancient texts. So ancient texts are usually made out of clay, like you can see right here. It's called a cuneiform tablet. We'll talk about that later. And with clay, what happens to it? It breaks over time. So you can see that there are some words right here, but then, oops, the clay tablet's broken. So that's when the translator would put ... because, well, we don't know what's in there because it's broken. Another would be just brackets themselves. So brackets means that there's a part of the original text is missing or deformed, but historians can figure out what words should be in the text. This again happens a lot with ancient texts, especially when you kind of have these little cracks in the clay tablets. So for example, this one says, to the sleeping one who lay at rest, to him who, so this part right here is chipped away. But historians can figure out actually what words should have been there. So that's why they put them in brackets. Would not arise from his sleep. All right, so how to analyze a historical document. There are many ways to do so. I encourage you to underline and take side notes on concepts you think are important or you're confused about. And in this class, I'll be asking you 3 main questions about primary sources. So when we read primary sources or analyzing other documents, there are going to be 3 big questions I'm going to ask you every time. The first question is, who are the authors of the primary sources? Second question is, who is the audience of these primary sources? Who are these primary sources written for? This one's tricky. A lot of students just say historians or students or everyone. That is not an acceptable answer. When we look at documents, you gotta think deeper about the time period. Who really were these documents written for? And the third question is, why were these primary sources written, and what message are the authors trying to get across? So let's take a look at an example. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. So this is what President Franklin D. Roosevelt said. And let's ask these questions. So the first question is, who are the authors of this primary source? Well, this one's pretty easy. It was President FDR. Yep, and that's it for the first question. Second question, who is the audience of these primary sources? Who are these primary sources written for? So I know that this was a speech that FDR gave to the American people in Congress. So I would say the audience is definitely Congress, but also just the United States people, addressing what happened the day before and why the US will be entering into World War II. Third question, why were these primary sources written? What messages are the authors trying to get across? So this primary source was written to A, inform Congress, and also to inform the United States citizens. The message that the author is trying to get across here is really explaining who attacked us, why they attacked us, how they attacked us, and what the US is going to do about it. Of course, if the speech continued, that's when FDR is going to ask Congress to declare war. So, all right, let's wrap this up. Today, we learned about history, time, BC, BCE, ADCE, timeline, primary source, secondary source, SIC, footnotes, dots, the brackets, and the three main questions to analyze historical documents. Next up, you're going to do U1L1, the incredible human journey, which is the first part. It's 0 through 30. I usually break up the ed puzzles when they're videos into 30-minute chunks. If you have any questions, please email your teacher. If you want to learn more, you can let me know. U1L1 will open up on Monday, September 8th for you to start. So I open up the folders weekly. So if you're getting this video done early before the due date, just wait until Monday and then the folder will be opened up for Unit 1. Again, let us know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. Bye.